Hold up. Is this your vehicle? What do you do for a living?
I'm standing at a gas pump. Am I being detained, officer?
Don't get smart. Hand me your ID. Now.
Not without a legal reason. What crime do you suspect me of?
You keep this up, you're going to be in cuffs.
Then say it on...
The date was July 8th, 2024. Assistant Chief Julian Walls had stopped at a Marathon gas station just off Interstate 85 near Charlotte, North Carolina, on his way home from a gym session. He wore athletic shorts and a plain black t-shirt. Nothing fancy. His SUV sat at pump number 4. The tank was full. The nozzle was back in place, and he was literally reaching for his car door handle when the patrol vehicle rolled into the lot. Officer Greg Sullivan stepped out of his cruiser. His Axon body camera was rolling, which was standard procedure for his department. He was 27 years old and had been with the local police department for just 3 years. Nothing about this moment seemed unusual to him as he walked across the hot pavement toward the pumps. He saw what he thought he saw, a black man at a gas station in a luxury SUV. That was enough. Walls noticed the cruiser pulling in, but didn't think much of it initially. Police officers stopped at gas stations all the time for coffee restroom breaks or just to fill up their own vehicles. He turned back to his car door. That's when he heard the footsteps approaching and a voice calling out to him. The officer wanted to talk. He wanted to know if that was Walls' car. He wanted to know what Walls did for work. He commented on the vehicle being a nice ride. His tone carried that particular edge that made it clear this wasn't a compliment. It was a question wrapped in suspicion. Walls had been in law enforcement for over 28 years. He knew exactly what was happening before the officer even finished his first sentence. This wasn't a random conversation. This wasn't community policing or friendly small talk. This was profiling, pure and simple. He had seen it countless times, had trained officers specifically not to do what was happening right now. And yet here he stood on the receiving end of it. The questions kept coming. Where did Walls live? Was he from around here? Why did he seem nervous? The officer stepped closer with each question, invading personal space in that calculated way meant to intimidate. Walls remained calm, his hands visible, his voice steady. He asked if he was being detained. The officer didn't give a straight answer, just pivoted to saying he was doing his job and keeping the community safe. Then came the demand for license and registration. No traffic violation had occurred. No crime had been committed. Walls hadn't been driving when the officer arrived. He was standing beside a parked car at a gas pump, but none of that mattered to Officer Sullivan. He wanted identification, and he expected immediate compliance. Walls asked for the legal reason for the stop. This question seemed to irritate the officer intensely. His tone shifted from suspicious to aggressive. He suggested that Walls was being defensive, that asking questions made him look guilty of something. The officer's hand drifted toward his belt in that universal gesture of threat that every black person in America learns to recognize. The body camera captured everything. The officer's approach, his questions, his tone, his body language. It also captured Walls standing completely still, hands visible, voice calm, doing absolutely nothing that could be construed as threatening or illegal. He was simply refusing to submit to an unlawful detention, which was his constitutional right. When Walls declined to consent to a vehicle search, the officer's demeanor darkened further. He began circling around Walls like a predator, asking more invasive questions. Where exactly had he been today? What gym? What was the address? He demanded specifics that Walls had no legal obligation to provide. Quick question for everyone watching. Have you ever witnessed something like this in person? Drop a comment below. Another customer pulled up to a nearby pump during this exchange. A woman stepped out of her vehicle and swiped her credit card, beginning to fuel up. She glanced over at the scene unfolding. The officer clearly focused on Walls with that intense law enforcement stare. The officer noticed her and called out, suggesting she might want to move to another pump for her safety. The woman's eyes went wide. She immediately stopped pumping, returned. The nozzle got back in her car and drove to the opposite side of the station. In her mind, a police officer wouldn't clear the area unless there was genuine danger present. She probably drove away thinking she had narrowly avoided some criminal situation. But there was no danger, no criminal, no situation beyond a man trying to leave a gas station after filling his tank. The officer's suggestion that other customers move away was a tactical choice, likely unconscious but revealing. By treating Walls as a potential threat, by creating the appearance of a dangerous situation, the officer was building a narrative. If questioned later, he could point to his caution, his concern for public safety. He was setting up justification for his actions. Walls watched this happen and felt the familiar weight of frustration. An innocent woman now believed something dangerous had been happening. If anyone asked her later, she would remember a black man at a gas station and police intervention. The officer was creating witnesses to a threat that didn't exist. Officer Sullivan reached for his radio and called for backup. He reported an uncooperative individual at the Marathon station. That word uncooperative would later be examined extensively in legal proceedings. Walls hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made threats, hadn't refused to show identification because of attitude or disrespect. He had simply asked for the legal basis of the stop, which the officer couldn't or wouldn't provide. The wait for backup felt endless. 3 minutes passed with both men standing in the morning heat. Walls remained beside his vehicle. Officer Sullivan stood several feet away, hand resting on his duty belt, eyes locked on Walls like he might suddenly bolt or attack. The tension was thick and entirely one-sided. Walls was calm. The officer was the one who seemed agitated, frustrated by the lack of immediate submission. When the second cruiser arrived, a female officer stepped out and immediately asked her colleague what was happening. He explained that he had a suspicious individual refusing to provide identification. The female officer, Amanda Price, looked at Walls and asked him to explain his side. Walls did so calmly and precisely. He had finished pumping gas and was about to leave. Officer Sullivan approached and began asking questions. Walls asked if he was being detained. The officer didn't answer directly. He demanded identification without providing reasonable suspicion or probable cause. Walls asked for the legal justification. The officer called for backup instead of answering. Officer Price turned to her colleague and asked if there had been a traffic violation. Sullivan said he didn't need one to ask questions, which was technically true, but he did need reasonable suspicion to detain someone, which Officer Price pointed out. Sullivan insisted Walls was acting suspicious. When asked to elaborate, he cited Walls's attitude as the problem. Price could see what was happening. She had enough experience to recognize a questionable stop when she saw one, but she was also in a difficult position professionally. Contradicting another officer in the field, especially in front of the person being detained, could create problems back at the station. The unofficial code of loyalty between officers often outweighed proper procedure. She tried a softer approach, suggesting that Walls just show his identification to make everything easier, so everyone could go about their day. It was phrased gently, almost apologetically, but it was still asking Walls to comply with an illegal detention just to make it go away. It was asking him to sacrifice his rights for the convenience of the officers. Walls addressed this directly. If he provided identification under these circumstances, he would be validating an illegal stop. He would be teaching Officer Sullivan that racial profiling works, that if you push hard enough and threaten enough, people will submit, even when you have no legal standing. He would be endorsing a system that needed to change, not be reinforced. Officer Price had no response to that logic because it was airtight. Officer Sullivan had apparently reached the end of his patience. He announced he was done playing games and ordered Walls to turn around and place his hands on the vehicle. When Walls asked what crime he was being arrested for, Sullivan said, "Obstruction." Walls pointed out that he hadn't obstructed anything. The officer claimed Walls was obstructing his investigation. Walls asked what investigation and what crime was being investigated. There were no answers, just the sight of Officer Sullivan reaching for his handcuffs. This was the moment where everything could have gone very wrong. Walls knew the statistics better than most people. He knew how these encounters sometimes ended. He knew that his rank, his title, His nearly 3 decades of exemplary service meant absolutely nothing in this moment because the officer in front of him wasn't seeing any of that. He was seeing only skin color and making assumptions based on that alone. Walls made a calculated decision. He slowly reached toward his pocket. Officer Sullivan immediately shouted at him to get his hands out of his pockets. Walls calmly stated he was retrieving his identification, which was what the officer had been demanding for the past several minutes. The officer yelled again to show his hands. Walls complied, moving slowly and deliberately. In his hand was a leather wallet. He opened it with careful movements and pulled out a card. He held it up so the officer could see it clearly. Officer Sullivan snatched the card from Walls's hand, his eyes scanning it quickly. Then he looked again more slowly this time. The color visibly drained from his face. The card identified Assistant Chief Julian Walls, State Bureau of Investigation, badge number 104. Officer Price leaned over to see what had caused such a dramatic reaction in her colleague. When she saw the credentials, her own expression changed instantly to one of shock and dread. The gas station seemed to go very quiet despite the traffic on the nearby interstate. If you're enjoying this story, smash that like button. You won't believe what happens next. Assistant Chief Julian Walls wasn't just any state officer. He wasn't even just a senior officer. He was an assistant chief, which placed him in the top tier of the entire state's investigative command structure. He oversaw multiple divisions. He made policy decisions that affected thousands of officers. He had the authority to implement departmental changes and direct major operations. He was among the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the entire state, and Officer Greg Sullivan, a local county officer with 3 years of experience, had just tried to arrest him for the crime of pumping gas while black. The stammering started immediately. Sullivan tried to say he didn't know, his voice shaking. Walls asked him a simple question. Would it have mattered if he wasn't an assistant chief? Would it have been acceptable to do this to someone else? Would it have been fine if Walls had been a teacher, a mechanic, an accountant, or unemployed? Did the badge make the stop wrong, or was the stop wrong regardless? The officer had no answer because there was no good answer. Walls asked if Sullivan knew why he had initiated the stop. Silence. He asked if there was any legal justification for the detention. More silence. Then Walls pointed out that Sullivan's body camera had recorded everything. Every assumption, every illegal demand, every threat of arrest. The entire encounter was documented. And none of it, not a single frame, was based on anything Walls had actually done wrong. Officer Sullivan tried to return the credentials, his hand visibly shaking now. Walls took the card back and asked for Sullivan's name and badge number. The officer provided them, his voice barely above a whisper. Sullivan was badge 892 with the Mecklenburg County Police Department. Walls turned to Officer Price and asked for her information as well. She gave it quickly, then tried to explain that she had just arrived and wasn't part of the initial stop. Walls acknowledged this, noting that he had observed her arrival. Then he asked if her body camera was also recording. She confirmed it was. Walls' instructions were clear and direct. Officer Sullivan was to return to his station and preserve the body camera footage. He was not to delete it, alter it, or somehow lose it. He was to report to his supervisor the following morning and explain exactly what had happened. Sullivan agreed to everything, looking like he might be physically ill. Assistant Chief Walls got into his vehicle and drove away. He didn't speed off dramatically, didn't slam his door, didn't make any gestures of anger or frustration. He simply left calm and controlled exactly as he had been throughout the entire encounter. The 2 Mecklenburg County officers stood in the gas station parking lot processing what had just occurred. Officer Sullivan's career had likely just ended, and both of them knew it. Officer Price knew her own actions would be scrutinized as well, though she had arrived late to the situation. 3 days later, the news broke publicly. Assistant Chief Walls had filed a formal complaint with the Mecklenburg County Police Department and initiated a federal civil rights lawsuit. The body camera footage was released as part of the legal proceedings, and within hours it had gone viral. Millions of people watched Officer Sullivan approach Assistant Chief Walls at the gas station. They heard every question dripping with suspicion. They saw Walls standing calmly, hands visible, doing nothing wrong. They watched the encounter escalate from unnecessary questions to threats of arrest, all because Walls refused to submit to an illegal detention. Legal experts analyzed the footage on cable news channels. Constitutional scholars broke down each moment, pointing out where the officer violated established law. Civil rights organizations shared the video as a textbook example of racial profiling. The footage was clear, professionally recorded by the officer's own equipment, and absolutely damning. The Marathon gas station's security cameras had also captured the encounter from different angles. That footage showed the full context: Walls pumping gas, normally finishing, preparing to leave, then being stopped and detained. There was no suspicious behavior, no erratic movements, nothing that would give any reasonable officer cause for concern. The Mecklenburg County Police Department called an emergency press conference. The chief of police stood at a podium looking exhausted and defeated. He read a prepared statement about taking the allegations seriously about Officer Sullivan being placed on administrative leave pending investigation about the department's supposed zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling. But the footage didn't care about press releases. The video evidence was irrefutable. This wasn't an allegation that required investigation to determine truth. It was documented fact, recorded in high definition with clear audio. "Do you think the officer should face criminal charges, not just losing his job?" Comment below. The legal process moved with unusual speed. Assistant Chief Walls's lawsuit was thoroughly documented with multiple camera angles, a clear timeline, and expert witnesses. He detailed civil rights violations, unlawful detention, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and discrimination. The Mecklenburg County Police Department had no defense against video evidence. They couldn't claim misunderstanding when every word was recorded. They couldn't argue about differing perspectives when the cameras showed objective reality. Their legal team knew they would lose in court. The only question was how much it would cost the department and the county taxpayers who funded it. Settlement negotiations began within weeks. The county wanted to avoid a trial that would generate even more negative publicity. Assistant Chief Walls wanted accountability and systematic change, not just a payout. His legal team pushed for both financial compensation and mandatory policy reforms. Officer Greg Sullivan was officially terminated 6 weeks after the gas station incident. The termination letter, which became public record, cited multiple policy violations, including unlawful detention, racial profiling, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming a police officer. Sullivan filed an appeal through his union, but it was denied after review. The body camera footage made his actions indefensible, even to the union representatives whose job was to defend officers. His state law enforcement certification was revoked by the State Standards Board. This meant Sullivan couldn't simply move to another department in a different county or state. He was barred from working as a police officer anywhere. His career in law enforcement was permanently over. The lawsuit reached a settlement 5 months after the incident. The exact financial terms were kept confidential as part of the agreement, but legal analysts following the case estimated the payout in the high 6 figures, possibly exceeding $1 million when including legal fees and costs. More importantly, the settlement included mandatory reforms for the Mecklenburg County Police Department. Officers would now be required to articulate specific observable facts constituting reasonable suspicion before detaining anyone. Vague terms like suspicious behavior or didn't belong were no longer sufficient. All body cameras had to remain activated during any public interaction, with severe penalties for officers who disabled them. Supervisors were required to review random samples of body camera footage monthly, specifically looking for patterns of discriminatory stops. The department also had to bring in outside consultants to conduct implicit bias training, which was different from the usual internal training that officers often dismissed. Independent auditors would review stop data quarterly for the next 5 years, checking for racial disparities in who got detained, questioned, or arrested. These changes were significant, though many activists pointed out they should have been standard practice already. The fact that it took a lawsuit against an assistant chief to implement basic accountability measures was itself revealing. Assistant Chief Julian Walls gave exactly one interview about the incident. He sat in his office at state headquarters, still in uniform, and spoke to a journalist who had requested the conversation. His words were measured and thoughtful. He explained that the lawsuit wasn't primarily about his own justice, though he certainly deserved that. He was in a position of power and privilege despite the discrimination he faced. He had resources, knowledge of the legal system, and professional connections. But what about everyone else who experienced this same treatment? What about the teenagers, the elderly, the working-class people who couldn't afford lawyers or didn't know their rights? They dealt with harassment constantly with no viral videos, no lawsuits, and no consequences for the officers involved. The journalist asked if Walls regretted not identifying himself immediately, potentially avoiding the entire confrontation. His answer was firm. If he had shown his badge right away, Officer Sullivan would have apologized and left. But he wouldn't have learned anything meaningful. He would have simply learned to be careful about who might have the power to cause him problems. The real issue wasn't how officers treated other officers or powerful people. The issue was how they treated ordinary citizens. And citizens shouldn't have to prove they're important to receive basic dignity and legal rights. That interview clip spread across social media, shared millions of times with comments ranging from support to anger to resignation. At the Marathon gas station where everything happened, people occasionally stopped to take pictures of pump number 4. Some posted them online with captions about the location where Assistant Chief Walls was racially profiled. The gas station owner, who had nothing to do with the incident, eventually placed a small sign near the entrance stating, "All are welcome here." It was a well-meaning gesture, though somewhat insufficient given what had occurred on his property. Officer Amanda Price, who had arrived as backup, remained with the Mecklenburg County Police Department. She faced an internal review of her conduct, but was not terminated or suspended. Some community members argued she should have intervened more forcefully to stop Sullivan's illegal detention. During depositions for the lawsuit, Price admitted she recognized the stop was legally questionable, but felt uncertain about contradicting a fellow officer in the field. She said the culture of the department made it difficult to challenge other officers openly. Her honesty was appreciated by some and seen as excuse-making by others. She kept her job, but requested a transfer to a different division shortly after the settlement was finalized. The body camera footage became one of the most viewed police videos of the year. It was studied in law schools as an example of Fourth Amendment violations. It was shown in police academies as an example of what not to do, though the irony of using it for training when the officer clearly already knew the correct procedures wasn't lost on observers. Activists and civil rights organizations used it in presentations and awareness campaigns. The video was powerful because it was crystal clear. No grainy footage, no missing audio, no conflicting accounts, just straightforward documentation of racial profiling from start to finish. Assistant Chief Walls continued his distinguished career with the State Bureau. He didn't seek publicity or leverage the incident for personal gain. He simply returned to his work overseeing major operations and policy development. 2 years later, he was promoted to Chief of the Bureau, making him the highest-ranking officer in the entire state law enforcement structure. He never gave another interview about the gas station incident. The video spoke for itself, and he had said what needed to be said. Greg Sullivan disappeared from public view entirely. He gave no interviews, made no public statements, offered no apologies beyond those required by the legal settlement. Some journalists tried to find him for comment to ask what he was thinking that day or whether he had learned anything. He never responded. The answer was obvious anyway. He had seen a black man with a nice car and made assumptions based on racial bias. He decided someone didn't belong and used his badge to act on that prejudice. And for once, there were actual consequences. The settlement agreement included one unusual requirement. Officer Sullivan had to write a letter to Assistant Chief Walls explaining his actions and thinking that day. The letter was private, not released to the public or press, but Walls later described it as deeply inadequate. According to Walls, Sullivan still tried to justify his behavior, claiming he was just being cautious in doing his job. There was no genuine understanding of the harm caused or the civil rights violated. Intent doesn't erase impact. The damage was done regardless of what Sullivan claimed to have meant. Are you still watching? Let me know in the comments because this next part is crucial. What made this case significant wasn't that racial profiling occurred. That happens thousands of times daily across America. What made it significant was the combination of clear documentation, a victim with resources to fight back, and enough public attention to force accountability. Most incidents end differently. Someone complies to avoid escalation. The officer leaves. Nothing gets documented. Life continues. No lawsuits, no consequences. The system remains unchanged. The video showed that compliance doesn't guarantee safety or fair treatment. Assistant Chief Walls was calm, respectful, and knowledgeable about his rights. He didn't get angry, didn't make threats, didn't give the officer any legitimate reason to escalate. None of that mattered to Officer Sullivan. The stop was never about Walls's behavior. It was about the officer's bias and assumptions. Legal experts who analyzed the case pointed out that Walls was correct at every step. He wasn't legally required to provide identification without reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. He wasn't required to answer questions about where he lived or worked. He wasn't required to consent to a vehicle search. He exercised his constitutional rights exactly as they're meant to be exercised, and the officer treated that as grounds for arrest. The lawsuit documents revealed additional details. Officer Sullivan's initial incident report, written before he knew about the lawsuit, stated he stopped to investigate suspicious activity. When required to define the suspicious activity specifically, he wrote that the individual appeared out of place for the area. That phrase did a lot of heavy lifting, out of place. What it actually meant was that Sullivan thought a black man didn't belong at that gas station with that car in that area. He saw someone who violated his assumptions about who belonged where, and he used his authority to act on it. Assistant Chief Walls donated a substantial portion of his settlement money to legal aid organizations that help people experiencing police harassment who can't afford lawyers. He wanted something constructive to come from his experience. He wanted to help the people who went through similar situations, but lacked his resources and position. The Mecklenburg County Police Department's policy changes looked good on paper. Whether they would be properly implemented and enforced was a different question. Changing policies was the easy part. Changing culture and ingrained biases was much harder. Some critics argued that Walls should have just shown his badge immediately instead of letting the situation escalate. These critics fundamentally misunderstood the point. The responsibility was never on Walls to de-escalate an illegal detention. The responsibility was on Officer Sullivan not to create the illegal situation in the first place. The viral nature of the footage did spark conversations in police departments nationwide. For ordinary citizens watching the video, particularly Black Americans, it confirmed what they already knew from experience. If this could happen to an assistant chief in the State Bureau, it could happen to anyone. In fact, it was happening to people every single day, just without the cameras and consequences. The gas station incident became a cultural reference point. When someone mentioned being racially profiled by police, the response was often, like that Assistant Chief Walls situation. It gave people a concrete documented example to point to when discussing issues that some people still wanted to deny existed. Last question before we wrap up. Do you think incidents like this are rare or common? Be honest in the comments. The Axon body camera company that manufactured Sullivan's equipment had no public comment on the case. Their product had functioned exactly as designed, creating an unimpeachable record of what occurred. Without that footage, the incident would have been Walls's word against the officers, and the department might well have believed their own officer over an outsider, even one who was a state bureau assistant chief. Technology forced accountability in a way that good intentions and policies never could. The camera was indifferent to rank, race, or narrative. It simply recorded reality. The final irony was that Officer Sullivan activated his body camera following department policy, probably believing it would protect him by documenting that he followed proper procedures. Instead, it recorded his career ending in real time. He likely never imagined the footage would be his downfall rather than his protection. The story isn't unique in its basic facts. Racial profiling happens constantly. What made this different was the convergence of clear documentation, a victim with resources and knowledge to fight effectively, and enough public attention to force accountability. That combination is devastatingly rare. Most encounters end with compliance. The person being illegally detained decides it's not worth the risk to assert their rights. They hand over identification, answer invasive questions, allow searches, and then leave. The officer faces no consequences because there's no complaint, no documentation, no problem from their perspective. The system that enables this continues unchanged. That's what makes the Walls case valuable, not because it was shocking in its demonstration of bias, but because all the elements aligned to create actual accountability for once. Officer Greg Sullivan lost his badge and career because he couldn't see past racial bias. He looked at a man and made assumptions based purely on skin color. Then he used his authority to act on those assumptions, expecting the usual outcome of compliance and no consequences. But the law didn't support his actions. The facts didn't support him. And most critically, his own body camera footage didn't support him. True power is not measured by the authority you hold over others, but by the integrity with which you treat them. When a system relies on the compliance of the oppressed rather than the accountability of the enforcer, it is not a system of justice but of control. We must build a world where dignity is a guaranteed right for all, not a lucky outcome for the privileged.